Ooh! The Wolfpack Podcast, is here. Episode Unidentified. Here with your favorite hosts, Pack and Milo. Cool kids, lifting, feels, fidget spinners, ADHD, and most important of all, tips on how to get bigger and stronger while also rambling about random stuff.
Hey, we're trying to buy time. What are we talking about today?
We are talking about protein, our favorite macronutrient. Woo!
Everyone's favorite macronutrient.
Everyone's favorite macronutrient, and I was going to say the most misunderstood one, but I don't think I can say that for protein.
It's odd. I don't ever really hear anyone saying we should eat less protein, which is nice.
Yeah, but you not in our niche, but in general,
Do you think?
protein has a bit of a
Maybe only with the kidney.
kidney placebo
Yeah.
and protein powders, and don't take those chemicals. But in our niche, no, I don't think so.
Yeah, which is nice because with carbs and fats, everyone says, oh, you're eating too many carbs, or some people say you're having too many fats, or what have you, especially saturated fats, what have you. So
Yeah,
it's-
with I mean carbs. I think
Protein's a bit more innocuous, I think.
carbs. I think would be number one.
Yeah.
Hated.
Yeah.
And then fat.
People
and
calling
then
fries carbs, for example.
Yeah,
Shout out to
that's
you,
crazy.
whoever you are.
Things that are very high carb but low fat are actually not the number one sort of carb sources that people present as carb sources. As you said, fries,
100%.
chocolate bars, and those are usually high in fat and carbs. Anyways, we digress. Protein. Take it away.
Well, we thought we'd do an episode on protein for a couple of reasons. One, everyone likes protein. We just had a 45-gram Faye yogurt with lemon juice and sweetener. So, shout out to Faye. Pronounced Faye.
Fire, yep, correct. And this sounds horrible. 0% fat, 0% fat yogurt with lemon juice and sweetener, but it's not. Take it from Fatso himself. It's actually pretty good. I specifically asked for it.
Indeed. He brought the yogurt, I brought the Skittles, and together we got our protein feeding in.
We made magic.
And that brings us to our second point. Protein is one of those topics where I think we feel reasonably qualified to speak on it without preparing, which is perfect because we didn't prepare. So here we go. Protein, what do you think about it?
I think it's great. Definitely something.
Peace.
Peace. I think it's definitely one of those macronutrients that, as you start, you tend to sometimes feel overwhelmed about because you hear about its importance and you are thinking, people travel, people have lives. You're hearing about a gram per pound of body weight. You're hearing sometimes from pro bodybuilders about higher intakes. You're seeing 300 and 400 grams per day in some extreme cases. And in general, you're hearing that you need your protein, and your protein is what will make a difference in your physique, which to a certain extent it is somewhat true. But we are here to tell you that things are somewhat simpler than they appear. And even if you are somebody who's living a busy lifestyle, who maybe is on a budget, you probably need slightly less protein than you think in order to optimize muscle growth and maximize muscle growth. And at the same time, you are probably going to be fine even if you don't hit that threshold a couple of days here and there, as long as you're training hard.
Right. So as you said, pretty simple topic. So I think it's time to wrap it up.
Yes, that's it. 1.5 to 2.2 grams per kilo of body weight. See you in court. Peace.
No, on a serious note, what Pac says definitely is true. I will say there are certain myths that have been circulating on our protein to a lesser or greater extent over the years, and I think it'd be interesting to address them. One of which could be that more protein is always better, and it's been somewhat refuted at this point, but I think it's still worth addressing.
Mm-hmm.
What would you tell people is the best, the optimal TM protein intake?
So let me just start by addressing the myth. I think because there is still some data out there to suggest that higher protein intakes are better for body composition. So in groups where they had two groups in a calorie deficit, one eating more protein than the other, the group that ate more protein maintained more muscle mass or maybe increased more muscle mass as well. So from that, people have obviously taken that and turned it into an extreme where they've presented protein as one of those supplements, one of those macronutrients that you can just, the more you eat, the better you are off in terms of body composition results. So once that, in terms of an optimal intake, research, so data shows, as much as I hate saying that, but data shows that anywhere between 1.5 to 2.2 grams per kilo of body weight is sufficient enough for you to maximize your muscle potential. And if you are, and it's important to also remember that training is going to be the main stimulus when it comes to muscle growth and retention. So if you're somebody who's trying to maintain muscle mass while traveling, getting some training in will be far more important than you trying to be always within that optimal range. Ideally, be close to that, but that's not going to be your game changer there. Your game changer will be training, and that's for people who are after fat loss as well as muscle growth in terms of maintaining muscle or increasing muscle mass.
Indeed, 100%. And you mentioned that figure. I guess my question would be, when is that not true? Like, are there cases where you want to have more or less even protein than that? And what proportion of the population does that cover? Like, as in, obviously,
that's
when
true.
you give a figure for training volume, for any variable that's numerical, continuous, what have you, a certain number might be ideal for the average person. But then, for example, if you want to cover more than the average, like let's say you want to cover 90% of people, what have you, then you might need more protein to cover everyone. You know, some people might need 1 gram per kilogram of body weight, as an example, extreme example, to maximize hypertrophy. Other people, on the other hand, might need more than that. And so there's a normal distribution around the mean of how much protein people need to optimize muscle hypertrophy. What sort of proportion of people does that figure cover?
So keep in mind, the context here is people like ourselves and people that want to gain muscle, etc. I think for general health, 1 to 1.5 would be more than enough.
Yeah, comfortably.
Correct. But I'd say it would cover the majority of the population. Are you heading somewhere with this?
Yes. So I'm pretty sure around 1.8 grams per kilogram is
Is more than
the
enough.
mean plus 2 standard deviations, which means in around 95% of people, it's sufficient to optimize hypertrophy. So basically, if you're having 1.8 grams per kilogram, in all likelihood, that's enough to optimize results. And I think that's what most people roughly should be aiming for hypertrophy.
For sure.
But then there's exceptions, like certain populations that might need more. I'm thinking of two specifically. What do you think they are?
Extremely muscular and active individuals.
Wow, we actually didn't think of the same people at all. So the two populations I was thinking of were elderly people and vegetarian or vegan athletes.
Oh yeah, sorry, that's true. I thought we were gonna segment into vegetarian and vegan athletes as a separate chapter, but yeah. And what I said it with while being hesitant because I was like, where are we going with this? But even extremely muscular individuals, the fact that you're calculating protein by kilo
of body weight or fat-free mass even.
And we don't have any data to support the idea that, hey, more physical activity, you need more protein than that threshold. But I thought maybe we were gonna dispel another myth.
No.
Before we get to vegetarian and vegans and cover elderly people first, and then I want to segment into just one more myth that we've heard about protein.
Sure. So with elderly people, generally you see that they benefit from higher protein intakes than regular middle-aged or young folks. I couldn't give you an exact figure. We can have it up on screen now. But generally, higher protein intakes are beneficial for older people, such that to optimize muscle hypertrophy, and generally for health as well, because sarcopenia, so that's the age-related loss in muscle mass and strength, because sarcopenia is a big deal for elderly people in terms of quality of life, life expectancy, and so forth. Higher protein intakes are generally beneficial for the elderly. So if you're, I'd say, above 50 or 60, citation needed, can potentially consider increasing protein intake past the 1.8 gram per kilogram figure.
Nice. That's very interesting. And I actually have my mother doing that. And because of that, I wanted to segment into the myth of higher protein intakes being bad for your health. We have data to suggest that even up to, I think it was 3 or 4 grams per kilo of body weight, there are a couple of studies out of Jose Antonio's
Mm.
lab, if I'm not mistaken.
The infamous protein researcher.
Yeah, where they also did blood work alongside with those intakes, and they didn't find any deleterious effects.
Mhm.
And I think that's important to use as reference, because when we're talking about general health and the general public, obviously terms and conditions apply, not registered doctors, physicians, or dietitians. This is just us discussing, but a lot of people will face protein with a bit of hesitancy because they've heard things about kidney damage and that more is bad and it's only for bodybuilders, etc. But even in much higher intakes than 1.8 per kilo of body weight, we've seen no serious deleterious effects, at least in people that don't already have a pre-existing kidney condition.
Yeah, pretty much. And I think in general that applies to the kidney claim as a whole. Unless you have pre-existing conditions, higher protein intakes really shouldn't be worried about when it comes to kidney function.
Yeah,
Cool. Let's move on to vegetarians and vegans in that case.
that's true. Yeah,
Or just in general, people who limit their potentially meat consumption, potentially egg consumption, dairy consumption, that sort of stuff. So not necessarily even vegans or vegetarians, just generally more plant-based athletes.
yeah, which falls under the broader category of protein quality. Is all protein created equal?
Hmm. And I can think of two things by and large that impact protein quality.
Mm-hmm.
One is how well it's absorbed, so how bioavailable it is.
Mm-hmm.
And the second one is the exact amino acid profile a protein has. So regarding amino acid profile specifically, it seems as though, and it's been a couple of years since I looked into this too deeply, but it seems as though there's one amino acid in particular that's quite important in terms of initiating muscle protein synthesis, and that's leucine. So leucine is one of the 8 essential amino acids, and they can be conceptualized as kind of the on and off switch, or rather a dial, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
wherein if you don't have enough leucine, you're not going to be initiating muscle protein synthesis. But up to a certain point, more leucine does result in more muscle protein synthesis. However, once you've turned that dial or turned on that switch, the actual muscle growth process is dependent on you having a sufficient amount of each of the 8 essential amino acids present. So, you couldn't just have leucine, 3 grams of leucine in a protein feeding and say, oh, I'm building muscle now. No, you still need enough overall protein and enough of each individual essential amino acid to build muscle. And so that's why you don't see people going around just having leucine instead of protein all day.
Except you as a younger lifter.
Indeed. Shout out to our previous episode, because now we're shouting out our own podcast. Sue us.
If it's the previous episode, it may be the future episode as well. Let's not commit to anything here.
We're non-committal. But yeah, so having a certain amount of leucine in your protein feeding is important, and that's been referred to as the leucine threshold.
Mm-hmm.
And this is actually something I looked into quite a bit before, because of I was a flexitarian back in the day. I didn't really consume much meat in my own consumption, and so I was supplementing with leucine, and that was a strategy because oftentimes, with the exception of a few pretty high quality protein sources for plant-based athletes, most of them do tend to be lower in leucine than most animal source of protein. And so yeah, if you're looking for a high quality protein source, generally look for something with a good amount of leucine and overall a reasonably balanced amino acid profile. And that's something where soy protein, most plant protein sources fall short a little bit, is that oftentimes they don't have as much leucine, and sometimes, this is much less so the case than is often believed, I think, but sometimes certain plant-based foods just don't have a good balance of all the amino acids.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's led to people trying to combine protein sources that, for example, have complementary protein amino acid profiles. So, for example, one protein source might have a good amount of 4 of the amino acids, but not much of the other 4, and then you combine that with another protein source that has the opposite, so you get a good amount of each individual amino acid, and thus create a quote-unquote complete protein source.
Yeah.
So that's the topic of amino acid profile. What about bioavailability?
Please.
Bioavailability just refers to essentially how well a food is digested. And so with most plant-based protein sources, generally their bioavailability is lower, which in addition to the worse amino acid profile can then lead to, per 30 grams, let's say, of plant-based protein, generally you'll see a lower spike in muscle protein synthesis and resulting generally muscle growth than you would from the same 30 grams of animal-based protein, because again, generally more leucine, generally more balanced amino acid profile, and generally better bioavailability, and thus better digestion.
Yeah. So for people that are not vegetarians or vegans, I mean, okay, for vegetarians who are consuming dairy, if you
Yeah.
are a vegetarian and you are consuming dairy and egg,
Eggs and dairy and whey both have quite good amino acid
you
profiles.
consume eggs as a
Leucine.
vegetarian as
Yes.
well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's only meat. Just
Yeah, it is.
even though I have very good vegan friends, I don't have many vegetarian friends, and I was just trying to make sure. But yeah, if you are a vegetarian who's consuming dairy, eggs, etc., on a daily basis and in relatively moderate amounts, you're probably covered.
Yeah.
At least at least much more than somebody who's not. But if you're a meat eater, protein quality, as long as you're not eating, I mean, even if you're eating one, like just chicken breast every day,
Mhm.
like let's take an extreme example, you'd still be, and you got all your protein from chicken, you'd still be near optimal in terms of protein quality.
Absolutely. I think the only exception for omnivores in terms of protein quality would be potentially if you're consuming really high levels of calories and you're still just shooting for 1.8 grams per kilogram. When
Yeah,
that's the
yeah.
case, what can happen is you're having so many of your calories from carb sources or
Bread,
predominantly
pasta, etc.,
or
yeah.
predominantly fat sources.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of the times, for example, pasta or bread may not be the highest quality protein sources. So if that's where you're getting all of your protein from, then 1.8 grams per kilogram of body weight may not be sufficient to optimize hypertrophy. And so in that case, you might want to shoot a little bit higher. But to be honest, unless you're someone who's really physically active or who in general to gain weight just needs a lot of calories, I would say that's relatively seldomly the case, especially for an omnivore who, again, you're getting a variety of food sources in. You're getting certainly some meat, I imagine. And generally that means that your protein quality is high enough to optimize results.
Yeah, unless you're that one weirdo who's eating 7,000 calories, and of those, most of them are bread and pasta. But
Yeah.
even there, one could make the argument that you're probably consuming some form of milk, some eggs, some meat. But yeah, if you're a meat eater, you have, or an omnivore, you have your bases more or less covered just by shooting for 1.8 grams per kilo of body weight.
100%. And I think for vegetarians, vegans, or generally just more plant-based people, obviously I don't want to give one blanket recommendation because, someone who's a bit plant-based or flexitarian
Yeah.
might not actually need any adjustment.
Mhm.
Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, someone who is vegan and doesn't eat any meat or animal products at all, in that case, you may actually need to have more protein overall to maximize hypertrophy and strength adaptations. I would say generally the figure of between 0, in case you're actually just barely avoiding meat and stuff, and maybe like an extra 50% of protein makes sense. So maybe up to 2.5 grams-ish of protein per kilogram of body weight for vegans might make sense, depending on how meticulous you are as well with selecting your protein sources.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that makes for a good segment to the topic of timing, because one could think, okay, I need X amount of protein per day, 1.8, let's say, just for the sake of the example. I weigh 100 kilos, therefore I need 180 grams of protein per day.
The math's there.
Yeah, I looked at you to confirm. I was like, okay, therefore I will have one huge meal of 180 grams of protein per day. Now, that's not necessarily the end of the world. You would still, if you're resistance training and you're hitting your calories and gaining weight, you'd still make solid gains. But if we are looking at things from an optimization standpoint and what makes more sense, if you want to make the most of out of your protein intake, breaking down your consumption of protein in feedings with an upper limit of, let's say, around 40 grams of protein.
I would say that's roughly accurate. So I can actually think of 2 studies directly off the top of my head on this.
Hit us.
One is a landmark study comparing area under the curve for muscle protein synthesis between having 8-10 gram protein feedings for 20 gram protein feedings, again evenly spaced all these protein feedings,
I know.
and then 2 40 gram protein feedings, and they found that the greatest area under the curve was with 4 20 gram protein feedings. So generally that's a good starting place, having at least 20 grams per thing. That said, I can also remember another study where they compared 20 grams and 40 grams,
right?
indeed.
Yeah.
And you do see that there is a marginally greater muscle protein synthesis response from 40 grams versus 20 grams. And I'm pretty sure this was all with whey protein, so pretty high quality protein. And so generally, if you're having, say, 4 meals a day, I think generally aiming for at least 20 grams of protein per meal is good, and making sure obviously that overall the daily protein is on point. That's the main thing, right? The timing is relatively unimportant in the grand scheme of things. What matters mostly is getting all of the protein in throughout the day.
For sure.
And then generally, because you see the best quote unquote muscle protein synthesis response with around 40 grams, I think if you can roughly, most of the time, right, like unless you're a 100-pound female, most of the time, spreading your meals into as many as it takes to reach your protein intake divided by 40, makes sense? So maybe, for example, let's say you're having 120 grams of protein a day. In that case, 3 meals, maybe 4 is a good start. If you're having 160, maybe 4, maybe 5 if you want to. But that's a good starting point. And in general, from the evidence I've seen, it seems like between 3 and maybe 5 meals a day is ideal for hypertrophy.
Yeah. Again, if you're the guy that wants to have one huge meal, which obviously is a bit of an exception, you could do so and still make gains.
Again, daily protein is the main thing.
Yeah. But as you said, that's why I mentioned 40 as sort of your rough upper limit.
Yeah.
And then your minimum would be somewhere around 20. So as long as every meal has 20 to 40 grams of quality protein sources or multiple protein sources, if you're a vegan or a vegetarian, you are more than covered.
Yeah, so that actually leads me into 2 things. One, in my own personal sort of practice, I guess, I will generally, if I don't have any protein on hand, I'll find a way to get 20, you know? And if I get 20, I'm pretty happy.
I'll find a way.
Hey, indeed. Nice.
I will kill. Is it completely dark outside?
It might be, yes.
We're in this sort of...
It's 2 a.m. here. We've been recording for 17 hours. We've got the next 19 podcast episodes ready.
It's 5.
We haven't.
PM.
You're breaking the immersion.
Yeah, but it's that time of the year in the UK where the weather says goodbye. And
indeed, we're gone.
We're gone. All right. Yes.
So yeah, that's one thing. Generally, I don't worry too much about getting 40 grams if I don't have anything handy. 20 grams is like, okay, I got it covered, right?
Yeah,
40 grams is what I'd like my routine to be like to optimize it, but 20 grams is pretty good. And I also recall some evidence saying that 20 grams and 40 grams, that sort of relationship holds up almost irrespective of body weight. So within pretty broad ranges, you probably don't need to have, let's say you're 150 pounds versus 300 pounds, you probably don't need to have 80 grams instead of 40, you know?
Yeah, I get that. That's something that was said a lot back in the day as a myth when talking about how much protein can you absorb, and that's where the timing comes in. Sure, you may be able to use up to a certain point, up to a certain amount for muscle protein synthesis, but it's not like the rest of the protein will go to waste. But one of the myths was, the big bodybuilder will probably need more than the smaller bodybuilder. But if we're talking about 2 people that are both resistance training, because you could make the argument that if you're not resistance training, you probably need less. But I wouldn't say, if you're 300 pounds versus 260 pounds, eat more protein per meal to maximize muscle protein synthesis. And one of so aside from not being able, aside from how much protein you can use per meal, the other thing that has been said quite a bit, or at least we know it as a myth, is peri-training protein and pre-bed protein, as well as also protein upon waking. So we have these 3 sort of time frames: waking up, protein, peri-training protein, and pre-bed protein. And we've heard quite a few different sort of claims made about those. The first one being that you need protein immediately upon waking to not go catabolic, which holds some truth. But again, in the grand scheme of things, if your calories and protein are in place and you're not a competitive IFBB pro bodybuilder who must make sure that even the last gram of muscle is there, you don't need to worry about that.
So I'll go with and against you a little bit. I'll go with you in that, yes, as long as daily protein is in place and overall calories and so forth are in place, it's mostly good. That said, there has been generally a push within the sports science community to have athletes incorporate more protein into their breakfast, for example. And that's as a result of most people's breakfasts just aren't that protein heavy.
Yeah.
And so that's essentially missing a chance to get a protein feeding and stimulate muscle protein synthesis throughout the day. And secondly, potentially more importantly even, is some people struggle to hit their overall protein intake. And so if they add some protein to their breakfast, that actually pushes their overall protein intake high enough to be optimal.
Yeah, but sorry, the angles coming at this from was forcing a meal or forcing breakfast as the first meal of the day, whereas, for example, me personally, I don't like to eat immediately upon waking. I will eat an hour or two later. But back in the day, people would go as far as saying you have to wake up in the middle of the night or have a shake next to your bed and down that the moment you wake up.
Yeah, so I think there's definitely some truth to what you're saying. I think generally, as long as you're having a meal within the first few hours of waking up, you're good. But I think if you want to optimize things, why not go the extra mile and just have it for the first hour or so after waking up? That's fine too.
Yeah,
I will say with regards to waking up to have a protein feeding, obviously not recommended because the decrement in sleep quality and sleep duration and so forth from that is almost certainly not worth it. Plus, you'll be that guy. You know the guy. I do think there is potentially some use to having a larger protein feeding before bed. And that's because... well, a few things. One, there's a few ways to accomplish it. One is to have a mixed meal, so something with fiber and or carbs and or fats. Specifically, mostly fiber and fats would help out. So the whole idea, for example, behind casein protein is that it's a relatively slow digesting protein, and so it might be more beneficial before sleep. However, whether or not that holds up is unclear, but the same sort of rationale would apply to a mixed meal with, for example, vegetables and some fats, in that fiber and fats slow down gastrointestinal tract clearance, or essentially digestion, which means instead of just having just protein that would get essentially absorbed and released into your bloodstream quite quickly, by having fiber and fats in your meal as well, that would then slow down digestion, slow down release into the bloodstream, and slow down the sort of peak in muscle protein synthesis you'd see. And thus, if you're having a meal before sleep, ideally have it as late as possible. It's not a huge deal if you don't have it like 10 minutes before going to bed, but having it late is a good idea. And ideally having a good amount of protein, both because you won't be having a protein feeding for, say, 8 hours or what have you, so it makes sense to have a higher protein feeding then. And secondly, also having ideally some sort of fiber or fats with it might be helpful.
Yeah, and keeping it relatively light in the sense of, don't have the majority of your calories pre-bed where it may impact sleep.
There's a couple of reasons not to have all of your calories pre-bed. The first one is it may impact sleep if you have a ton of calories, although the evidence on meal timing and meal composition for sleep quality and stuff is really not that clear. Anecdotally, you can say that if you have a huge meal, you feel bloated and you don't feel your best sleeping. Some people have the opposite, where if they don't eat, they feel super hungry and can't sleep. So I think it's mostly down to personal preference and how you experience the process, I guess. But the second reason not to have all of your calories before bed is mostly with weight loss stuff. So what we see in evidence comparing having most of your calories earlier in the day versus having most of them later in the day is that when you have more of your calories earlier in the day, people generally have a higher energy expenditure. And so if you're trying to lose weight or even maintain weight and you're struggling to do so, maybe having more of your calories early in the day and having just a snack before bed with protein is helpful. And vice versa, I've got clients who struggle to gain weight. In that case, typically, without explicitly telling them, if I have to increase calories, generally I'll do it more so towards the end of the day, and vice versa.
Because that works via physical activity or just general activity.
Neat, yeah.
Yeah, so because if you eat earlier in the day, you probably move more throughout the day, even doing what we're doing now, fidget spinning, as well as being a bit more active versus eating later in the day. Yeah, and the big myth with protein before bed was particularly with protein sources. So, and you dispelled that myth nicely there, so that the myth-ish was that you need a specific type of protein pre-bed so that it's slow absorbing. But if your meal composition is adjusted in a way where some fats or fiber are included, then you're still looking at slower digestion overnight. But again, even if you don't hit that last meal before bed on some days, it's not the end of the world.
100%. And I think one thing I forgot to mention with leucine and meal time and protein timings and so forth is one thing that's been talked about is potentially there being a refractory period. So essentially, once you activate muscle protein synthesis by having, say, 2 or 3 grams of leucine alongside a sufficient amount of essential amino acids, there's a certain time period after that where even if you have another protein feeding, it's not going to activate it again to the same extent. And so that's why generally certain meal frequencies, so example, we said 3 to 5 meals. That's probably in part why those meal frequencies are better than, say, higher meal frequencies, or at least they're not better if you have higher meal frequencies, and why a certain meal frequency may be beneficial. So at least doing, say, 3 meals a day, because if you're only having 2, you only essentially get 2 chances at increasing muscle protein synthesis, which you're missing out on, say, 1 or 2 more chances to do so. And because there's potentially like a sort of cap almost, or at least somewhat of a ceiling to how much you can elevate muscle protein synthesis and muscle growth with a single protein feeding.
Yep.
If you only have 1 protein feeding a day, for example, you might be missing out overall on more area under the curve of muscle growth and muscle protein synthesis.
Yeah, that is definitely a good point. And I always feel guilty when I have a big protein feeding and then like an hour later I have a protein bar or something. I always think, nah,
What a waste.
what a waste of protein. It's not really a waste, but yeah.
Ideally,
you'd space it out a bit more. And the last sort of timing category is peri-training nutrition. So over the years, we've talked, not we, but in the community, we've talked about the anabolic window and eating protein pre and post workout and its importance in recovery and stimulating muscle growth. The data shows that as long as, well, it shows that one, the anabolic window is more of an anabolic barn door, and there's plenty of time for you to consume protein post-workout, especially if you've consumed enough protein pre-workout, so the 2 to 3 hours before your workout. If you've had a solid protein feeding, and especially if your meal composition also includes fat and fiber, you probably have a few hours post-workout where you can still maximize protein synthesis by consuming 20 to 40 grams of protein.
Yeah, pretty much. The way I see it is, as long as you have a protein feeding somewhere around your session, say a few hours before, a few hours after, you're good. And the way the anabolic window, quote unquote, works in a sense is just that, let's say you have 2 versions of you, right? One version of you went to train at 4 p.m., one version didn't. If the same version of you has a protein feeding, say at 2 p.m., both of them have that protein feeding at 2 p.m., but then one of them goes on to train at 4 p.m., the version that went to train at 4 p.m. likely saw a slightly greater effect on muscle growth of that protein feeding than they would have if they hadn't trained at all. So it essentially augments the productivity or the effect that protein feeding had. And so yes, there is such a thing as an anabolic effect of training on protein intake, if that makes sense, such that the act of training enhances the effect that a protein feeding has. So having a protein feeding somewhere in proximity of your training session makes sense, instead of just having it like 6 hours after or 6 hours before. But it's a very wide window, and it's not a huge effect either.
Yeah,
essentially.
Yeah, that's a great point. And obviously, the session itself will have you in an environment where, for quite a bit of time, things are pretty anabolic, so to speak.
Or are they? Because actually there was a camp back in the day, and even nowadays, where obviously when you're training, muscle protein breakdown is stimulated or enhanced. And so there's a camp for a while that said, hey, before your training session or during your training session, have some protein so that you can attenuate muscle protein breakdown. What do you make of that?
Have protein before your workout?
Before or during, because when you're training, right, and you're damaging your muscles, quote unquote, you're enhancing muscle protein breakdown, or rather muscle loss, essentially. And so by having protein before or during a session, you can attenuate that and thus see more growth overall.
I think that if you've had protein before, you don't need to have protein during. If you are completely fasted, maybe there's something to that.
Sure.
But I wouldn't, if you're somebody who loves training fasted and you wanted to absolutely maximize muscle growth, I'd say, hey, maybe you can get like an amino acid supplement to have intra-workout just in case. But I would say that the effect would be, in the grand scheme of things, the effect would be trivial if your training performance was not heavily affected by being completely fasted.
Yeah, so I think you're bringing up 2 good points. One is...
and because there's the scenario where you're not training fasted, but you've had carbs, and that is a different scenario as well.
For sure. I think you're bringing up 2 good points. One is in all these studies that look at protein intake and muscle protein synthesis and so forth in relation to the anabolic window and so forth, is that they're often looking at just whey protein instead of mixed meals. And in real world, you're not just having a whey shake, you're having oftentimes a mixed meal. And so that can very much impact the duration of the spike in muscle protein synthesis and so forth. Another thing to bring up is that generally the increase in muscle protein breakdown may just not be meaningful. So one thing I've learned about in my undergrad, for example, is that generally the rates of muscle protein breakdown are like 4 to 5 times as low as the rates of muscle protein synthesis. And so, yes, you could attenuate muscle protein breakdown, but it's happening at such a slow pace anyways that it's not really something to worry about in the first place. So yeah, generally that is a consideration.
Yeah.
Nice. One thing I wanted to bring up is protein quality for vegans. How would you go about making sure that vegans get sufficient protein or sufficient quality of protein?
Just including a variety of different sources would be the best idea, but also considering the use of a supplement like soy protein.
Yep.
And that would, in most cases, more than cover you.
So that was actually something I want to come back to now, pretty much, was a couple things. One, what are good, high-quality sources of protein for vegans? And secondly, there's been some claims made around concerns over excessive soy intake and health. Is that something you worry about?
I wouldn't necessarily worry about the latter unless you're absolutely freaking it.
Mm-hmm.
But even there, I'm not entirely confident about my own knowledge around soy and health. From the few things we've looked at with my vegan friend and nutritionist, Chris Sitas, on soya and derivatives of soya, on a variety of health markers. There's actually a few systematic reviews that show positive effects, maybe trivial positive effects, but positive effects on things like cholesterol, maybe. I can't remember off the top of my head. But I do remember that because there are people that criticize soya a lot, especially in things like protein bars, etc., and some of its derivatives, claiming that it has deleterious effects on health. The evidence does not seem to suggest that. And good sources, good protein sources for vegans, I would say, do you want to name actual food?
You can say food groups, and that would work pretty well.
That's where my English may be limited, so I would say things like beans, lentils, chicken, beef. What, you're not allowed to have chicken and beef?
Oh.
Rice, pea. What are those called?
Pea? Vegetables?
No,
legumes?
Yeah, legumes.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to say. But I'm not.
Yeah, generally I think those are pretty good recommendations. Soy is obviously another one. Soy is one of those protein sources that's vegan, but has.
So list,
admittedly.
So I'll edit this. So list the groups.
So generally, soy protein is pretty high quality. Beans and variety of beans are good. Pulses, so like lentils, for example, are good. Some vegetables can be decent, especially when combined. They might not have a lot of protein per 100 grams, but in terms of protein to calorie ratio, they're decent. And generally, that should cover you pretty well.
Yeah, for sure.
If you're vegetarian, generally, a lot of good protein sources. Milk is huge, so dairy products are huge for good protein quality in terms of both leucine content and also digestibility. Then eggs are a pretty high quality protein source as well. So generally, as a vegetarian, sure, your meals might be a bit monotonous, but you don't have to worry about the quality of the protein feedings you're having.
Yeah, for sure. Especially if you are on the milk and on the dairy and egg train, you are definitely covered there as a vegetarian.
Nice. So I think now what we could go into is how you actually take all of these ideas and apply them to your diet. Like, how do you take all of these findings from research that we've cited extensively in this video?
Extensively, yeah. The infamous data shows.
How do you take those findings and apply them to your own diet and how you approach nutrition?
Sure. So after you've calculated, and one calculator that you can use to calculate your daily energy requirements, a cool website that does that is salerabbit.com/BMR. We'll put a link in the description, and it basically has different formulas that are in the literature for calculating energy expenditure and activity factors, etc. You're going to have a play around with that, or any sort of basic total daily energy expenditure calculator. Calculate your daily calories. If you know your daily calories already, or roughly what you need to maintain body weight, or to gain body weight or lose body weight, depending on your goals, then you can multiply your body weight in kilos by 1.6 to 2.2, depending on whether you enjoy having more protein in your diet. A good sort of reference point, as Milo said, is 1.8. So you could go ahead and do that directly. But I do have clients who say, hey, I love eating a lot of meat. Can I eat more protein than I need to maximize gains?
So you ask them, do you hate the planet? And they say yes.
And I'm like, good. The planet hates us as well. Just kidding. Don't cancel me.
Plants have defense mechanisms.
Yeah. Extreme. That's a separate episode. We love the planet and we recycle. I lived in Germany, 7 different recycling bins. I've earned my joke. So multiply your body weight in kilos by that number, by 1.8 or any of the other numbers in the range, and then you are good to go with your daily protein intake that you can hit in different meals. So you could divide that number by 40 or by 20 or by 30 and have a suggested amount of meals per day.
You could also
protein
do
servings. Sorry.
You could also do sometimes a bit higher if you're very heavy or have you, but I think generally that works pretty well. Because otherwise you might have a 100-pound female that is having 1 or 2 meals a day, which may not be ideal.
That's true. That is a good point.
So generally that works pretty well, I'd say. I guess one thing, how would you adjust these recommendations for vegetarian/vegan? Because obviously they're having more protein, for example. Would you have them have more meals?
If they want to, sure.
Yeah.
If they don't, not really.
Yeah, I think generally the meal recommendations should stay the same.
Yeah,
because
3 plus ideally.
Yeah, the equivalent, let's say 40 grams of protein as an equivalent for vegetarians or vegans would be, say, 50, 60 grams. And so as long as each meal has roughly that amount, let's say, then the amount of meals they should be having is the same, right?
Yeah. And one thing that comes up often is convenient protein sources, especially when traveling, and that's where experience will come a bit into play. And things like what we just ate. So we ate a whole tub of yogurt each. That was nearly 50 grams of protein. So more than 1/4 of, or actually 1/4 of our daily intake.
Yeah.
In one serving, very low calories, easily accessible. So for people that are very busy and don't have time to cook or don't cook or have to sort of eat food from takeaway places or I don't know meal prep services. I mean, if you're doing the latter, then you know how much protein you're getting. But if you need a lot of protein and you are constantly on the go and you can't be carrying Tupperware in your corporate office and having lamb kebabs with rice or I don't know chicken or beef in the middle of a meeting, some really nice go-tos are yogurt. Yogurt with protein powder is an even more OP alternative.
Combo, yeah. Although you must hate yourself flavor. Protein powder can taste okay, I agree, but it's just
chocolate protein powder in the yogurt we had and maybe some syrup. It's top notch.
I guess, yeah, if you're dieting, it can be nice.
Yeah, so yogurts, protein bars can also be a game changer.
Protein powder, obviously.
Protein powder, so having a shake with you that can easily be anywhere from 25 to 60 grams of protein in a few sips.
Yep.
Low calorie as well, and you're getting just protein. Protein bars have come a long way in terms of flavor and protein quantity. I buy a specific brand they have it in the US as well, My Protein, but they make some cookies that have 38 grams of protein. And because I travel quite a bit, those are a game changer when traveling or moving around. And in general, any sort of dairy drink that is milk or
chocolate milk, for example.
Chocolate milk, those are also a good option on the go.
Yeah, so I'd say there's a few more things. There's quark, for example, which is kind of quark or skyr. Both of them are essentially yogurt kind of things.
Fake yogurts.
That are even higher protein, usually, and relatively satiating too.
Liver.
Another thing would be eggs. Eggs are kind of a double whammy for hypertrophy, potentially.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, you have the protein, which is decent. However, if you're dieting, for example, you may not want to include them a ton because they're not that satiating per egg, for example. Like, sure, you get some food, but it's also relatively high amount of fat, and fats aren't always the most satiating, which is actually something we get into, which is the satiating effects of protein. But yeah, so eggs can be decent, both for their protein content in terms of quality, amount, and digestibility, but also for the cholesterol you find in the egg yolk. So there's some evidence now, not a ton, but a decent amount, that dietary cholesterol maybe a good starting dose would be around the equivalent of 2 to 4 egg yolks a day on average is a good starting place for enhancing the adaptations you see in muscle hypertrophy and muscle strength. So potentially you might see an edge in hypertrophy and strength if you consume more dietary cholesterol to a point than if you didn't. So having some whole eggs in your diet might be helpful in that sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think eggs, dairy-based products, whey protein, soy protein as well can be decent. All kinds of like beef protein can be decent as well, that sort of stuff.
Any protein powder.
Yeah, generally. Obviously, there's some lower quality protein powders and higher quality protein powders, but I think nowadays most protein
You
powders
gotta
are
go
decent
out of your way
to find a really bad one
get
nowadays.
what, collagen.
Yeah, collagen is not recommended because again, it's a single amino acid, and if you're getting a single amino acid,
What are you doing with your life?
indeed.
But yeah,
And then generally, obviously, meat as well. Meat, not necessarily the highest quality protein source, but generally quite a good quality protein source. So beef, chicken, fish, lamb, other animals I can't name right now, mutton, whatever,
ostrich.
lamb,
But
mutton.
yeah, we're talking mostly about like easily available on the
indeed.
go sources. Which
Nowadays, in some highly developed countries like Britain, shout out to Pack British Citizen,
Let's go.
you can even find cooked meats as like a finger snack almost.
Yeah,
in
or
supermarkets.
things like beef jerky.
Indeed.
So yeah, you could get a pouch of beef jerky here that I think has around 30 grams of protein.
The only TNC that is potentially kind of expensive, but hey, if you're watching this podcast, I know you make 8 figures. So do we.
If you're not,
Enjoy
please
King.
Stop watching and
Or Queen.
bang your head on the wall until you forget all the episodes you've seen, because this is the 8-figure club.
Indeed.
8-figure straps and not 8-figure incomes.
So I think
Yet.
last thing we can touch on is whether or not protein is inherently more satiating than
Mhm.
other macronutrients and what your take is on that.
I think that some of the claims on protein and satiety are somewhat overstated, but at the same time, it may be. So, if you're somebody who's trying to maximize muscle growth, and let's say you're dieting, because I assume, or you're somebody who really likes to eat, a lot of the protein sources that we mentioned are going to be relatively low calorie because they're high in protein, and most times just that, unless you're talking about fatty cuts of meat or fish. So by eating those higher protein sources, and plenty of them, you're probably consuming a larger volume of food overall. And because protein may be somewhat more satiating than other macronutrients, it may help you stay fuller. Now, will having a protein shake completely erase hunger? No.
Yeah, so that brings us to a few points. One of the reasons why protein, for example, is deemed to be potentially more satiating is that it has a higher thermic effect, which is essentially when you consume protein, your body has to spend a certain amount of energy to digest the protein, break it down, make it available into energy, use it for various things like building muscle or maintaining cell structures and so forth. And different macronutrients have a different thermic effect or energy cost to being used, essentially. And thermic just refers to it being like a thermic temperature output of the reaction. And so essentially it's an efficiency thing where protein is a bit more inefficient to process, and so you burn more calories, relatively speaking, while processing it than you would for carbs or fats. So potentially, gram to gram, you can have more grams of protein for a given amount of calories than you would be able to for carbs. And with fats, it's different because fats have 9 calories per gram of fat, but generally, protein can be beneficial in that way. But practically speaking, oftentimes, you're not just talking about a macronutrient in its pure form. So unless you're talking about whey protein or protein powder, which likely isn't the best option for satiety anyways, because oftentimes if you're having a shake, generally liquid calories aren't as satiating as solid calories. And so, yes, protein might be satiating, but for a vegan, for example, going into contest prep, that can be a rough challenge because a lot of their protein has to come from high quality protein sources. But soy being a really good quality protein source, and soy protein being, a powder, oftentimes that means they have to choose between getting a good amount of high quality protein in and being as satiated as possible. And so, yes, protein can be more satiating gram per gram potentially, but oftentimes when you're comparing, say, a food with lots of protein to a food with carbs, the food with carbs can actually win out So fats usually I'd say are probably less satiating than foods with high protein. But with carbs, oftentimes you're talking about stuff like vegetables or fruit with lots of fiber and relatively low calorie densities. So basically, how many calories does that food have per 100 grams? And so in those situations, oftentimes I think carbs will actually end up being more satiating. And so one of the things we mentioned earlier was that more protein isn't always better. Like passed around, say, 1.8 grams per kilogram of body weight or so, you don't see a benefit to hypertrophy or strength adaptations if you had more protein. And if you had more protein, that would be at the expense of having more carbs or fats. And so especially in a situation where you need to manage satiety, for example, having more protein may actually be a net loss in that you're not having more carbs, and those carbs can be more satiating because you're allowed to have an extra salad or an extra bowl of rice or what have you, anything that can be more satiating. And so I think the protein being more satiating thing can often be miscommunicated or misapplied.
Yeah, especially when you take into consideration fiber, and also it's mostly talked about in the context of weight loss, in the context of people who are not already consuming a lot of protein. So it's one of the plus points for eating more protein. So if you're listening to this podcast, chances are you're already eating plenty of protein, and we don't have to pursue you that you need to eat a bit more protein because, hey, it may be more satiating than whatever you're doing now. So last but not least, I think it's important to quickly go over the myth of, hey, thermic effect of protein. We've heard that your body uses more energy to process it. Can I eat unlimited amounts of protein and not gain fat?
No, absolutely not. So any of the macronutrients can be converted to fat. And so if your body is taking in more energy than it needs, any of those macronutrients, like you could be having pure protein, if you're taking in more calories overall than your body's consuming, then eventually that protein will be converted back into fat tissue and stored as fat tissue. And that goes for carbs, that goes for fats. Now, certain macronutrients are more easily converted to adipose tissue than others. So hence, for example, why protein has a relatively high thermic effect. But that doesn't mean that just because you're having pure protein in your diet that you can't gain fat. You can definitely still gain fat. And overall, it'll probably be a pretty similar effect whether you're having 2,900 calories of just protein versus 2,900 calories of protein, carbs, and fats, provided the surplus is the same in terms of how much fat you're storing in the end.
You heard it here first, folks. And I think that wraps it up for our protein episode.
Indeed, it does.
Nice.
So let's do our goodbye flex.
And we'll see you next time. Eat your protein. Peace. Don't overeat it, though. Peace.